Mr. O'Mara-Huttig, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, first of all, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. And it is great to be back in Chicago. In fact, it's great to be back here at Chicago University, where I also gave a speech last year. I know that Chicago is one of several US cities which claim to be the home of the largest number of Danish Americans. And let me tell you that I certainly always feel very welcome here. And I want to thank the Harris School and the Council on Global Affairs for having me today. I've come to America to highlight the enduring value of NATO, to thank the United States for its continuing support and leadership in the alliance, and to stress that solidarity within the alliance is a two-way street, that Europeans and Canadians stand shoulder to shoulder with their American allies. More than 60 years after its creation, NATO remains the vital link between the United States and Europe to protect and promote the core values of American and European civilization: freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Our relations with Russia also play an important role in that equation. Now, some of you may ask, why? I know that Russia is still seen in some circles as our former Cold War foe, but it has been a long-standing strategic objective of NATO to help create a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. We have made great progress, but we are not there yet, and I maintain that Russia plays a key role if we want to achieve it. And I want to discuss three issues with you today. First, why NATO and Russia need to work together. Second, how we are already working together. And third, how to move our partnership with Russia forward. So first, what brings us together? When the Cold War ended, we may have had false expectations about each other. Some in the West thought that Russia would align its interests with ours. And many in Russia thought that since the Warsaw Pact had dissolved, NATO should too. Both these expectations proved to be plain wrong. They hampered the relationship between NATO and Russia for a long time. Yeah, they even brought it close to a complete standstill. Ironically, at the same time, the case for broader and more solid NATO-Russia cooperation became more and more compelling because the threats to the security of our nations increased all the time, both in number and in complexity. Terrorism, fragile states, piracy, proliferation of nuclear weapons. These are all global threats that affect all our nations. And there is no way for any single nation not even the world's most powerful nation, either to escape these threats or to tackle them on its own. The best way to meet them is through the broadest possible international cooperation. And NATO and Russia have a vital stake in that cooperation and a major responsibility for driving it forward. Finally, let's not forget one more obvious reason for us to cooperate. Russia and the United States hold more than 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. This means that both countries have a special responsibility to work together on nuclear issues. And NATO has a stake in that too. So clearly, we have an obligation to cooperate. So my second point is how we work together. In Lisbon last November, we agreed with President Medvedev to develop a true strategic NATO-Russia partnership. This decision was grounded in a sober assessment of the new security environment. But it was also accompanied by a strong determination to translate solemn words into action. And we have seen concrete action in a number of areas these last few months. For example, in the fight against terrorism, Russia had the most recent experience with terrorism when a suicide bomber blew himself up at one of Moscow's busiest airports last January. But this is a continuing common challenge that concerns all our nations. NATO and Russia decided just last month to step up our cooperation, preventing terrorism, combating terrorist activities, and managing the consequences of terrorist acts. NATO and Russia are also cooperating more closely on Afghanistan. Despite its own difficult history with the country, Russia has realized that it has a strong interest in a more stable Afghanistan. We have cooperated for some time on counter-narcotics training in Afghanistan and Central Asia to stop heroin from flooding into our countries. Russia has also allowed transit of equipment through its territory in support of our Afghanistan mission. Just recently, we agreed to start providing training, spare parts and toolkits for Russian-made Afghan helicopters. This will help the Afghans to provide security for their own country. And that, in turn, will benefit the security of our nations. These are significant achievements. My third point is, how do we move forward? And first of all, we must acknowledge that we don't always see eye to eye. NATO and Russia still have disagreements of principle on issues such as Georgia. We insist on full respect for Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And we call on Russia to live up to her international obligations in that respect. And we move away from discussing these disagreements. But neither must we allow them to paralyze our partnership. The NATO-Russia partnership must be rooted in realism and concrete cooperation. But it also needs a clear vision. President Obama's leadership in resetting the US-Russia bilateral relationship has brought us much closer towards that vision. A real milestone was the entry into force earlier this year of the New START Treaty. It will lead to a drastic reduction in the number of US and Russian strategic nuclear weapons. This has given a strong push to our relations with Russia. I believe we have another great opportunity to advance our relationship with Russia through missile defense. Today, over 30 countries have or are developing ballistic missile capabilities. And several of these capabilities potentially pose a direct threat to our countries. This is why NATO has decided to build a defense system against those missiles. And we have invited Russia to cooperate with us. What we have in mind is cooperation between two independent missile defense systems. If we achieve this, it will be a tangible demonstration that NATO and Russia can build security together rather than against each other. And the same vision must guide us on other important issues. This includes negotiations on conventional forces in Europe and on further reductions on nuclear weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, those of us who remember the Cold War want a different future for our children and grandchildren. A future where the mistrust and suspicion between NATO and Russia is consigned to the history books. A future where we engage in frank dialogue, even if we sometimes disagree, and a future where we cooperate effectively to meet our common challenges to fulfill the vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. I'm convinced that this vision is well within our grasp, and with the support of you and your great nation, we can make it a reality. Thank you very much.